Well, my name's Matt Schmit. I represent Senate District 21 in southeastern Minnesota, and that includes my hometown of Red Wing and the counties of Goodhue, Wabasha, Winona, and just a little slice of northeastern Dodge County. It's essentially the area that surrounds Highway 52 between Rochester and Minneapolis-St. Paul, and also the Mississippi River on the east. So you got beautiful river country down there, rolling bluffs, some great farmland, and it's just really special to be able to represent a district I grew up in and had spent so much time of my younger years there. So it's been a couple of years, 2 years now, that I've been in office. I was elected in 2012, and my committee assignments really match up quite well with the district I represent. I do energy and environment issues. They gave me the gavel for the game and fish subcommittee. They must have been desperate. That's been a lot of fun dealing with the DNR on hunting and fishing regulations. Also agriculture and rural development issues, and I'm on a finance panel that oversees spending in all of those areas. And then also the capital investment committee, which deals with infrastructure investments in Minnesota. So it's been a very fast 2 years. It's been a very rewarding 2 years, and I guess I look forward to the next couple of years of my first term.
Great. So you kind of talked a little bit about your experience with rural Minnesota, but if you could really dive into that, like what is your experience with rural and small communities throughout the state?
Sure. Red Wing's not a small community by any means. It's around 16,000. But having grown up in southeastern Minnesota and not always relied upon the Twin Cities for entertainment or for shopping or for commerce, you just realize just how important rural Minnesota is in retaining our identity and making sure that our rural communities are competitive in the 21st century and have a shot at succeeding in attracting new families and retaining young people. And so it's really instilled in me, and I think a lot of folks who grew up in rural parts of the state, a sense of community. It's really great to be able to go out, downtown and see a bunch of folks and some people appreciate anonymity. I really enjoy running into friends and family and others as I run errands around town. And I think that's something that a lot of rural Minnesotans take great pride in, is that sense of community, those rural values, and knowing that the community they grow up in really has something to offer and is going to be competitive, not just in the next couple of years, but for the long haul. And from an economic standpoint, from a quality of life standpoint. And so the things that I really appreciate growing up in smaller communities, the chance to get out on my bike and go and do a long 20-mile bike ride on county roads, or room to run and play, and just to see the bluffs in southeastern Minnesota, for instance, the trout streams 5 minutes away from going fly fishing, which is great. A lot of hiking opportunities, and those are the sorts of things that I wouldn't trade anything for. And that's something that brought me back to southeastern Minnesota after I completed my undergraduate, graduate careers, and it's something that I'll always look for in a community that I want to call home.
Great. So what are the biggest issues that you see facing rural Minnesota communities and the individuals that kind of live there?
Sure. I think it comes down to the same issue that's facing a lot of communities, whether you're, in rural Minnesota, greater Minnesota, suburban or urban parts of the state. It's competitiveness. It's that sense that, if we were to raise a family in a rural part of the state, that our kids are going to have every opportunity that kids in the metro or suburban school districts might have. That if we were to start a business in rural Minnesota, that we're going to be able to succeed and have a quality of life that, is, expected in the 21st century. And I think that's a challenge a lot of communities face. I think it's particularly true in rural parts of the state where, distances separate you from maybe it's commerce, from other economic opportunities, from cultural programs or others, from recreation. But on the flip side, I think that the rural parts of the state offer so many natural advantages, and I had kind of mentioned just recreation, being able to go out for hikes and biking, and cultural amenities like arts. I know down in Red Wing we have a beautiful Sheldon Theater and a lot of arts and programming that comes through on a regular basis. And so I think that the challenge is maybe unique insofar as the distances that separate us, but I think technology is really changing how those challenges face us and what we can do to kind of be competitive in the 21st century. So I'm really optimistic that rural Minnesota is going to have a lot to contribute to the economy in the years ahead, and that rural Minnesota is going to be a place where folks are going to want to call home. And whether that means young people staying in rural Minnesota, or rural Minnesota attracting new families, folks who may have grown up in urban part of the state or suburban part of the state, but that want that sense of community that they might have been lacking otherwise. And so I'm very optimistic, but on the flip side, it's important for for policymakers to always be thinking about how to, to help rural communities, become more competitive. Obviously, we want to make sure that we're funding our schools adequately, that we're giving our rural roads and bridges all the funding they need, that we're investing in infrastructure, and that other programs, whether it's technology or arts or recreational opportunities, that you have the same kind of level of commitment, financial commitment from the state that metro or suburban areas might have.
So then, you kind of touched on parts of the rural narrative, the story that we tell about
Sure.
rural areas, but if someone were to ask, what is the rural narrative,
Yeah.
what is the rural story, how would you characterize that?
Sure. Well, of course, there's probably not one rural story, but I think, it really does come back to that sense of, you grow up in a smaller town, a lot of folks, everyone might know you. You have, a small class that you grow up with, people that you really get to know and stay in touch with. And it's that sense not only of community, but maybe of extended family that stays with you. And that's something that I've really seen and experienced and enjoyed in my life, is being able to reconnect with people that I've known since I was 5 years old. And that can be true anywhere, in Minnesota, but I think it's particularly true in our rural areas, where you just have those smaller numbers and in the sense to really get to know each other well. And that's something that I've really appreciated. I think it's an advantage of rural Minnesota. Another thing that, just as an active person, I absolutely love being able to get outdoors, and I love to see the crop grow. And they say knee high by the 4th of July with our corn crop. Obviously, that's a good thing, but we like to have the corn taller by the 4th if we can. And just seeing that change in seasons that we all can experience throughout Minnesota, but it's really vibrant and noticeable in rural parts of the state. And that rural narrative, I think, for a lot of communities, you see the young folks go to school, they graduate, and they're hit with that choice. Well, do I stay and get a job? Maybe it's on the farm, maybe it's in town, or do I go and seek additional schooling? And we have great community and technical colleges throughout much of greater Minnesota, but a lot of times, young people will choose to leave, and you probably witnessed this yourself. And the challenge, I think, for greater Minnesota, for rural parts of the state, is that value proposition. What are we able to offer young people to come back? Whether you're returning to the hometown you grew up in, or what can we offer young families that might want to have that sense of small town rural values that they may not have had growing up. And I think that's part of the narrative, ever more so in the years ahead. And I know you had a question about immigration and emigration. I think that's something that really is changing rapidly. You don't necessarily have a net outflow of young people, but you have an inflow of new immigrants and workers who want to have an opportunity for employment or education or those rural values that we've already talked about. And so I think that inflow, that outflow of new people, it's really interesting, and I think it's changing that rural narrative from one community to the next around Minnesota. And that's something that it's happening right now. We're living history, and it's going to be fascinating to see what our rural communities look like and what that rural narrative is in 5 or 10 years down the road.
So then, what similarities and differences do you see kind of between the needs of urban and rural areas? Where do they need the same things from policymakers
Sure.
and communities, and where do they kind of differ?
Sure. Well, historically, I think you would maybe expect metropolitan areas or suburban districts. They may have more of a need for social programs, help with unemployment or else transit, for instance, investments. I think other similarities, beyond transit are just basic transportation infrastructure, sewer and water, sound quality education system. I mean, those needs are going to be anywhere throughout the state. But one thing that I think is really changing is the fact that the needs of greater Minnesota and of our rural communities have evolved quite a bit in the last generation. And we have more students in our schools for whom English is a second language. And those, I guess, those challenges, are tough for our schools to deal with. But on the flip side, we've had schools in Minnesota dealing with that for many years. And so I think that there's an opportunity for our rural districts to really connect with our suburban and metro districts and talk about, hey, what are the shared challenges that we're facing in our communities? I think that technology is something that's also been a barrier in the past. You may have access to, for instance, high-speed internet. It used to be electricity, but we did something about that, a couple generations ago, when everybody had electricity to their homes and their farmsteads. Now you're seeing a gap form in technology, and folks who may be in metro areas or more highly populated areas may have access to higher speed internet or what have you, and that's a big deal. Whether it's with e-commerce or telehealth opportunities, or with distance learning, even precision agriculture, you're seeing this. There's all sorts of applications with access to high-speed internet. And you see some parts of greater Minnesota and rural communities have great access to high-speed internet and 21st century technology, others that lack it. So those differences aren't just between rural areas and in metropolitan areas, but there are differences among different rural areas throughout the state. And I think that's something that we've got to focus our attention on moving forward, is trying to narrow those gaps, whether it's in education funding or transportation investment, and also in 21st century infrastructure like telecommunications. And so the story is definitely changing, but we do see comparisons and contrasts throughout Minnesota.
So then, kind of to piggyback off of that last question, what are the kind of policy changes that you think would positively impact small towns, and what changes are you kind of interested in seeing to support small towns?
Sure. One thing that I'm really serious about is just making sure that the way we raise revenue for our education funding, for our roads and bridges, for just funding state and local government is equitable around the state. And what you see typically is higher property tax wealth in our urban or suburban areas. That's not always the case, but one thing that we have to really keep an eye on and be mindful of is what that property tax burden is for folks in rural Minnesota. We've seen agricultural land values just shoot through the roof in recent years, driven by increases in commodity prices. These are good things, but it does put a lot of pressure on a lot of our rural communities and in our farmers. And there's a changing I guess reality with the family farm and consolidation in farming, and that's been a challenge for a lot of our rural communities too. You have maybe fewer families that farm in larger farms, and I think that's something that we've got to try to grapple with as policymakers. There may not be an easy answer to addressing some of those challenges. Global forces may be pushing some of those changes. But I think one thing is just making sure that we raise revenue fairly in Minnesota, both in the metro, suburban, and in rural parts of the state, that we're adequately funding our schools and recognizing that the challenges that rural districts are facing are increasing over time, and that we've got to make sure that we're giving them the resources to compete, that we're making sure that we invest in infrastructure, like I said, roads and bridges, sewer and water, these sorts of things that we take for granted. But when they start to crumble and when there's problems with their safety or their maintenance, we see it and we end up having to pay the price eventually. And so just making sure that we're investing in all corners of the state in that kind of infrastructure. And also, as I'd mentioned, making sure that we're investing in 21st century infrastructure, so that regardless of where you live in Minnesota, you have access to 21st century commerce, to high quality of life, that you're able to say, if we raise our kids in the town in which we grew up in, they're going to have a great education, and they're going to be able to do anything they want, and they're not going to be at a disadvantage for growing up in a rural part of the state. And so I think as policymakers, we need to weigh all of those sorts of considerations, and I think the last couple of years, I think the legislature and governor have done a pretty good job of trying to balance rural and metro needs, but it's always a tension, and you're always trying to strike that right balance. And those are just some of the highlights. I mean, we could probably spend a long time talking about the challenges faced by rural Minnesota and opportunities for making investments and giving them a leg up. But I think those are some of the big things that we should focus on as legislators moving forward.
So what do you see as the future for small towns? We've talked a lot about kind of where small towns are and what
Sure.
that means, but where would you like to see them in 15 to 20 years? And we've talked about those kind of policy changes, but are there any other changes that would be necessary to meet that vision?
Sure. I think I'm really optimistic about our small towns, and I think Minnesota has a great tradition of agricultural economies. A lot of manufacturing is competitive in our rural communities in greater Minnesota. We're seeing a rebound in employment and economic growth. But if you really look at the numbers, a lot of the economic growth is driven by Minneapolis, St. Paul, Rochester, some of our larger regional centers. And that, we've got to make sure that we're doing what we can to keep our smaller communities competitive. and they're facing all sorts of pressures from agriculture consolidation to historically the brain drain, as you might call it, young people going to college not returning afterwards. But I think the great equalizer in all of this, and I don't mean to hammer on this too much, but is technology. And I think if you have access to high-speed internet anywhere in the state, whether you're in the metro area or in rural parts of the state, I think that you're at a competitive advantage with folks in rural parts of other states, for instance. And I think you could have it all. You could live in a place where you truly love. You can work in a place that is economically competitive. And I think that's really important, because I think despite all of the great news we've had on Minnesota's growth and recovery out of the economic downturn, our state's not firing in all cylinders unless we tap into the creativity and the entrepreneurial spirit of folks in rural parts of the state. And nowadays, that medium isn't simply roads and bridges and the interstate highway system. It once was the transcontinental railroad, then the interstate highway system. Now it's that information superhighway that is the internet. And I think that's the great equalizer. And the extent to which our private providers, our cooperatives, the state and local and federal governments are able to, get on the same page, trying to maximize investments in this sort of 21st century technology and access to high-speed internet, I think the better off our rural parts of the state will be. So I'm really optimistic that folks who grew up in rural Minnesota, who want to live in rural Minnesota, are going to be able to have it all. The high quality of life, the rural values, and also the access to 21st century economic opportunity. And so that doesn't just happen. We've got to talk about it. We've got to put resources in place to make sure it happens. And I think at the end of the day, if we're smart, if we focus on the right things, I think folks in all parts of Minnesota are going to be able to enjoy high quality of life in the years ahead.
So kind of the last question.
Sure.
This will be shown to rural developers, community developers, and leaders. It's freely available online. So assuming that you're kind of talking directly to those people who are doing that hands-on work in small towns, do you have any messages or any questions or any comments that you'd like to address directly to them?
Well, first of all, I would say that I think some of the best ideas that we have, at the state or federal level, come from our local communities, our small town, EDA officials, our local elected leaders, our business community, folks in education or agriculture. And I think it's so important for us to have that open dialogue. Don't assume that the legislature in St. Paul has all the answers. God knows we don't. And that's certainly the case with Congress in Washington. And I think it's important for us to have that continued dialogue between folks who see it on a day-to-day basis and people who are in a position to do something to improve competitiveness, for instance. And so I think we've got to continue to talk about our shared vision for the future and what our challenges might be and where we may see opportunities for investment and rallying energy. Another thing I would just mention is that I think we have to be bold. Regardless of where you live, where you're coming from, never limit your vision for what your community can do. And I think it's so important that you really have that attitude of reaching for the sky and trying to set yourself apart from other communities or from other states, and have a bold vision and bring together the right stakeholders, the right folks to talk about how to get from point A to point B. Because I think if you don't talk about it, if you don't dream it, it's not going to happen. And I think that's so important to dream big, to be bold, and to really try to position yourself to make those dreams and those visions a reality. So I know that's easy for me to say, but it's so true in my mind. And so I think that hopefully the combination of new investments the state and maybe federal government are making, opportunity for private sector entrepreneurialism and innovation, and also just energy and new ideas. That's the right mix, I think, for rural Minnesota to really be firing on all cylinders.